Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Statistics Solutions webinar on Chapter 1. Okay, just a couple of things before we get started. We have a co-host on. Yep, right there in the chat box, who's going to be posting where you can access this webinar as well as other webinars that we archive on our website. Also, if you want to, schedule a consult just to see after the webinar to see if what we offer is right for you, that link is there too. Sarah can also help you if you have any questions, regarding the availability or any other questions that don't relate to the actual content. Okay, so we're going to go over the webinar. As we go through it, if you have questions, that's fine. Just if you want to jot them down, or you could even type them into the chat box or the question and answer box, so you don't forget them. But the thing is, I'll get to them at the end. So when it's over, we'll have a question and answer session. Okay, so let's get started. Chapter 1, the introduction. This is what we're going to be covering today as far as the contents of the chapter. Our template is based on kind of a standard, social studies dissertation template, where it's typically 5 chapters. The dissertation, where chapter 1 is the introduction, chapter 2 is the literature review, chapter 3 is the methodology, chapter 4 is the results, and chapter 5 is the discussion. Okay, and these the content for chapter 1 or the features are pretty standard. And I'm going to say this now, and you're going to hear me repeat it several times throughout the webinar. Always obtain your school's template for the chapters and for the dissertation, because while there are a lot of commonalities and a lot of things that are typical across dissertations, sometimes schools will have particular requirements, or sometimes the headers may have different names, or they may be in different order or something. So you always want to follow your school's template if they have one. Sometimes if your school don't have a template, your chair can give you like a sample, like an approved dissertation from a school that they'd like you to follow. But having said that, this will work as a good general template. Okay. All right. So chapter 1, just to kind of pull back for a minute to look at things in a bigger picture for a minute, as the introduction to the study. Chapter 1 really kind of think of it as a blueprint, right? It's chapters 1, 2, and 3 are typically the proposal, called the proposal for your study. In other words, the 1, 2, and 3, they're what you're proposing to conduct your study on. This is what you're planning on doing. And chapter 4, then you collect data, you get your proposal approved, you collect data, present that in chapter 4, and you discuss the results in chapter 5. So where chapter 2 is the literature review, chapter 3 is the methodology. Chapter 1 is kind of more, like I said, the blueprint. Here's what you plan on doing. And it should basically answer like 3 big questions. It represents the what, the why, and the how of your study, right? So the what is the topic, right? What you're doing. It's going to introduce the reader to the topic, what you're doing. It's also going to talk a little bit about why, the what, why, and the how. In other words, why are you conducting your study? Why is it needed? Why is it important? So the why questions will also be partially answered in the chapter 1, and also the how question. We know what you're going to talk about. We know why. How are you going to do it? How are you going to conduct your study? And a lot more of the how is involved in the chapter 3 in the methodology. but usually there's some discussion of it, some preview of it in the chapter 1. In other words, like your research design, you know, your research questions, how are you going to, you know, collect data. And again, that stuff is all, you know, worked out in much more detail in chapter 3, the method section, but sometimes there are sections in chapter 1 that talk about the how. All right, so those are the big areas that the chapter 1 hits. And these are the sections. Let's move into each one now. Okay, the introduction to the chapter 1, which is itself called the introduction. So the introduction just really kind of like any introduction, right? It happens to be the introduction to the entire study. But like any chapter introduction, it's going to orient your reader on what's going on, right? So you want to introduce your topic, right? What your study is going to be on and why it's necessary. That's kind of what you're going to do in this opening section. Now, all the details, right, are going to come later in the chapter. You're going to flesh things out, fill things out more, so the reader understands connections better. But this is going to introduce the topic and why it's important to study. So usually studies proceed from some kind of organizational or social problem, right? It can be, you know, if it's in education, it can be, you know, declining grades in a certain, you know, level, or school, you know, school level school grade. It can be, or a certain population, a certain sector of the population. It can be declining test scores, declining grades. It can be, why I say like special education teachers, why they leave the profession, right? So whatever it is, you want to introduce the problem, right? You want to do it in a way that shows that it's a problem that gets the reader's attention, right? So sometimes you can use statistics, right? If there's a statistic that shows how many special education teachers are leaving the profession, you can use that. It doesn't always have to be statistics, you know, it can be just a supported source that kind of indicates that there's an issue or a problem, right? Whatever you use for that, whether it's a, you know, peer-reviewed source or it's a statistic, you want to make sure it's recent, right? Especially a statistic, because if you use a statistic from 15 years ago, 20 years ago, I mean, things change, right? I mean, things have changed. The numbers are different, right? So use something recent. And it also tells your reader that, hey, this is a problem now. This is a recent problem. Something that was a problem 20 years ago, again, may not be a problem. We may have research on it already. The issue may have been resolved, or at the very least, the issue has changed or the numbers have changed. So always use, you know, keep things recent. And that's something you should keep in mind throughout the chapter and throughout the dissertation. When you get to chapter 2, sometimes schools have requirements that research be, you know, within a 5-year window or a 5 to 10-year window. But especially the chapter 1 and especially the research problem, when we get to that, try to keep things recent when you can, because again, it shows that the problem is happening, right? That it's a recent problem. It's still a problem, not something that occurred 10 or 20 years ago. Now, if it occurred 10 or 20 years ago and it's still a problem, I mean, you can obviously reinforce that with more recent citations. So get the reader's attention, introduce the organizational problem, but you also want to introduce a little bit about you know, what research has been done on this topic. So in other words, what's the research problem? What research has been done? What do we know? What still needs to be done? Right, and that's what the research problem is, which we'll get to in a couple of sections down. What's the research gap? What's the knowledge gap, or what's the research issue or research problem? In other words, why is the study needed? So we have the social problem, the organizational problem. You're going to set that up, introduce that, and then talk a little bit about what you're going to be doing that's unique and a unique approach to this organizational problem, right? Because if it's a problem, there's likely research on it, right? So the research problem then, and what you're doing, what's unique is kind of something that's different than what everybody else is doing. And you want to kind of, again, introduce it here. You're going to flesh it out later. But the introduction should introduce the social organizational problem, introduce the research problem, what's unique about your study to address it. State what is needed to address the research problem, right? How your study is designed to address the research problem, state that specifically. So at the end of the section, and it's not long, maybe a page, something like that. The reader should know what you're studying and why at the end, what your topic is and why you're going to be studying it. In other words, what the research problem is, why we need more research on this topic, or a different kind of research, or the specific angle you're taking. You can also end the section if you want with sometimes people end with a preview of sections that are going to come in the chapter. The background, it follows right from the introduction, right? You're introducing, here's the problem. Here's what we know about the problem from the research. Here's what's still needed, okay? Now, flowing from that comes the background. Now you're going to catch the reader up on, okay, you've introduced the topic, you've introduced why research is needed on it and what your study is going to do. Catch the reader, get the reader up to speed. Okay, so this is what the background is. This is the background on the problem, and it's not just the issue or the problem, like the background on teachers leaving special education, for example. It's also a background on the research that's been done on it. Sometimes people fall down on that part. They get that it's a background on the issue. They get that, but it's also a background on, look, here's what the research that's been done on the topic to date. Here's what we know based on this research. And so that should kind of funnel toward what we don't know, or the research that we still needs to be conducted. And that's where your study is going to come in, right? So this can be chronologically structured, right? Going back in time to kind of give us a sense of where the issue came from. And it's kind of a broad strokes treatment, right? I mean, you're not getting super specific. You're noting trends in the research, right? What have research has focused on in the past? What are some of the major findings? Give us a kind of point by point that way. Where are we now, right? As far as the research goes, where are we as far as what we know and what we understand about the topic, right? And so all this leads to, you should be highlighting what we don't know, what's still unanswered in the research, and hence the need for your study, right? Because your study needs to be a unique contribution. Right. I mean, in other words, you don't want to study something that's already been studied to get knowledge or data that we already have. I mean, it's pointless. So to think about that background that way. It has some historical material about the nature of the problem, some historical material about the research that's been conducted on the topic. But also going toward what we need, right? Kind of funneling down to what specifically you're going to be doing. Okay, right. So it ends with where the research on the topic stands and what's still needed, which is where your research problem comes in, which is the next section. So this transitions, it funnels down kind of to the research problem. And we'll talk a little bit about what a research problem is, because in my experience, I've noticed that, folks writing dissertations, this is the first time that you've done it. So it's understandable that you don't quite, have a handle on everything. It's completely understandable. So the research problem sometimes tends to be a little slippery. So the research problem it's like it sounds. It's a problem in the research. So what does that mean? It means there's still unresolved issues in the research. It means there's still maybe knowledge gaps. there's some kind of issue or problem or contention or inconclusiveness in the research, right? And that's what your study is designed to address. Okay, that's what your study proceeds from. I mean, the research problem really drives the entire study. It's like the why of your study, you know, so it's a large part of the why. Why are you conducting this research? Well, because we don't have knowledge on a certain topic, or we don't have a certain kind of knowledge, or we've never applied this theory to try to understand this phenomenon. Okay, so what is the research problem section? This is where you kind of, you in very specific terms, describe what the research problem is. So how do you do that? You know, it's a really more targeted than the background, which is kind of a, you know, you're looking at, you know, trends in the research and what's been done, what hasn't been done. You're doing that in the research problem, but it's more focused, right? It's a targeted overview of the recent research on your topic that highlights the need for your study. It highlights the research problem. It specifically states the research problem and specifically states that your study is designed to address the research problem. How long is this section typically? Again, check your school's template, but I would say, you know, a couple pages at the most, you know, 1 to 2 pages. It should be pretty concise. I mean, if you find yourself writing the research problem section and you're going on for pages, it's probably indicative of it's not focused enough, right? Because, you know, if it's not focused, it's easy to kind of go and then. So it needs to be pretty focused. And what does the section look like? Really, you're kind of bringing together some of the most recent research on the topic. What you're doing is you're showing what we know, right? Here's what we know about why teachers leave the profession, special education teachers leave the profession. Here's what the research has told us. Yet, you know, so you're driving at whatever your research problem is, right? Whatever that happens to be. There's something still missing in the research. There's still something that's inconclusive or something we don't know. That's what you want to highlight by bringing in the research from, you know, previous researchers. Here's what we know. Consequently, here's what we don't know, right? Here's what we still have questions about. And that's where your research comes in. That's the research problem. Now, there's different kinds of research problems. A gap in knowledge is one kind of research problem. It seems to be one that people kind of like to gravitate toward. I think it's because it's easier to understand, and that's fine. I just want you to know that it's not the only kind of research problem. It is one of several different kinds. So a gap in knowledge, right? A research problem could also be something like we have lots of one kind of research, one type of research on this topic, but very few examples of another type. So for example, there's lots of research on a topic that's qualitative, okay? Well, now we need some quantitative research to help kind of confirm relationships between constructs, or it's the reverse. We have a lot of quantitative, a lot of statistics-driven, numbers-driven research on the topic, but we need now, we want research that digs in and gets in depth and gets at some of the complexities. And we need qualitative research, right? We need to interview people and get their, you know, talk about their experiences and their perspectives. You know, so there's different kinds of research problems. Like, you know, a topic has only been approached predominantly in one way. And now we need to approach it another way, or we need to use another theory, or we have this information that as it applies to certain populations, but not these other populations. Okay, so there's all kinds of ways to frame your research problem. But the hallmark of it is that it needs to be unique, right? That you need to have a kind of unique approach. Somehow there's different ways to get there, a unique approach that will yield unique information that you can add to you know, our understanding of the topic. And a quick note about you know, if your research problem is a gap in knowledge, sometimes, you know, people struggle with that. It's like, how am I supposed to write about a section on the research problem when my research problem is a gap in knowledge? You know, they just say, well, we have no research on blah, 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 whatever it is. Okay. Well, you can say that, but you have to show that, you know, and then, so how do you show that there's no research on a topic, right? It's like, so somebody once told me to think of a donut when you're thinking about your research problem as a gap. You know, if you have a donut, and how do you describe the donut hole? Right? By definition, how do you describe something that is by definition absent, right? A gap or a hole. And the answer to that is you describe the research around it as close to it as you can get, right? Well, we have research on this, we have research on this, we have research on this, and it frames the absence, right? And then once you state, well, we don't have research on this, your reader then gets it because you've shown them, well, we have research very close to this, but not exactly what I'm intending to do. So that's one way to think of how to kind of frame your research problem when it's a gap in knowledge. Okay, and for all these sections, you know, use your resources, go to webinars, you know, use the internet, use your school librarians, use your chair, any resources at your fingertips. But sometimes, you know, I always suggest this, sometimes there's just no better help when you sit down to write than a good example, right? So get an example from your school, from your chair, you know, ProQuest through your school's library publishes dissertations. Get one from your school, as close to your, you know, to your discipline, maybe even one of your chair's old the dissertation that went through your chair and they approved. Sometimes they'll give them to you as examples if you ask them. But so when you're sitting down to write the research problem, for example, and you've listened to me and you've read other material, and yeah, I get it. And then you sit down and write, and it's like, no, I don't get it. That's where sometimes having an example like at hand really helps. Okay, so next, the purpose. There's a purpose statement and purpose section. And the purpose section is usually not too long. Again, probably less than a page, maybe a paragraph, maybe two. And the purpose statement, and I have some examples here on the screen. The purpose statement usually has a very specific construction. So you want to follow that, right? So, and the purpose statement begins the purpose section. All right. And the purpose statement reads something like this: the purpose of this approach, design, study is to examine or explore. A verb is not so important. The concept variables in whatever sample or setting you're using, right? So that's the kind of formula. And here are some examples here. I'll just read one of them. The purpose of this quantitative correlational, that would be approach, quantitative design correlational study, is to examine, words like examine, investigate, more typically associated with quantitative studies. Verb like explore would be suitable for a qualitative study. So the purpose of this quantitative correlational study is to examine the relationship between transformational leadership and emotional intelligence. Those are your concepts or your variables. And in whatever sample, and, you know, high school teachers and, you know, a Midwestern district, something like that, high schools. So in whatever sample or setting, and that's the construction. And really the kind of the purpose statement, it's a nutshell of what you're doing in your study. It doesn't tell you why, right? But it tells you what you're doing, right? The purpose of this, right? It's got your approach, your design, and what you're looking at, and in what, you know, in what people and what setting. Qualitative example is really similarly constructed. It just has a different verb. I used explore there because some qualitative studies tend to be more exploratory. Now that's your purpose statement, and it begins the purpose section. The rest of the section may include some specific information about your variables, your concepts, sometimes even, list the instruments that you're using if you're using instruments to measure your constructs. That's typically it. See what else, if your template calls for anything more. Usually, again, a paragraph, maybe two. Now, the other thing with the purpose statement, the statement itself, is if you need to mention your purpose statement somewhere else in the dissertation, you should restate it verbatim, right? Because your purpose does not change. Don't change it to make it sound a little different. Oh, it's going to be repetitive. It doesn't matter. It's your purpose statement. It doesn't change. Okay. Your research questions are the same way. They don't change. So if you have to put your research questions in another part of the study, restate those verbatim as well. But those are the only two times you got to pass on that. If it's not the purpose statement or the research questions, if you're trying to pull material from one section and use it in another section, professors frown on that. Okay, so don't do that. Only with the purpose statement and the research questions. Okay. The research questions themselves, this is not a methods seminar, so I'm not going to go into anything about how to develop research questions. We do have methods seminars that you can sign on for if you're interested in that. Other than just to say that this is usually where the research questions come, and the research questions we know are they're what guide your investigation, right? That's the information you're looking to obtain from your study, and so they're the guiding factors of what you're doing. Okay, next usually comes a theoretical framework, and it's another little slippery area. And sometimes it's called a conceptual framework. So, two big questions right off the bat here is what is a theoretical or a conceptual framework, and what's the difference, right? So let's go into what a theoretical framework is, and then we'll kind of go into the difference between a theoretical and conceptual framework. So theoretical framework it's really something the researcher builds or puts together to help. It helps guide the study, and it helps explain kind of results at the end. So it consists of theory or theories. It depends. Let's just take an example because this is the best way to talk about it. Let's go back to our purpose statement, if you remember that, one of them, the quantitative one. So we're going to do a study on transformational leadership and emotional intelligence. Okay. So our theoretical framework then would consist of the theory of transformational leadership and a theory of emotional intelligence, right? Because those are the factors you're studying. Now, for quantitative studies, it's important that your theories match your instruments, right? So let's just take emotional intelligence. You're going to use a theory of emotional intelligence because you're studying emotional intelligence, right? That makes sense. There are several instruments to measure emotional intelligence, right? You want to pick one select one that's most suited for your study. Okay, let's say you select Goleman's instrument. He's a big theorist in emotional intelligence. So you're using Goleman's instrument. All right, so when you start talking about the theory of emotional intelligence in your theoretical framework, you want to use Goleman's theories, right? Because there's going to be other instruments. I mean, let's say, this is just made up, but let's say Smith has one. Smith's instrument, it's a little different than Goleman's, right? Obviously, it wouldn't be the same. Then why have it? It might focus on different things. It might give emphasis to different components, right? So Smith's is different than Goleman's. If you're using Goleman's instrument, use Goleman's theory, use Goleman's theoretical basis. right? Because instruments are derived from theories. They don't just kind of spring out of nothing. Instruments have their foundations in theories. So if you're using Goleman's instrument, use Goleman's theories. You get that? So don't use Smith's theories, because it's going to, while it will still be a theory of emotional intelligence, it's not going to be a theory that's going to align with your instrument. All right. And the same for transformational leadership. That would be the other part if we're using this example of emotional intelligence or transformational leadership, right? Your theoretical framework would consist of those two theories, right? And make sure that, you know, the instruments you're using, who develop them, matches with the theories that you're going to be talking about in the theoretical foundation. Okay, so what do you do in the section? Well, first of all, you want to define the theory. You know, you want to say something like the theories of transformational leadership and emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence will serve as a theoretical foundation or theoretical framework for the study. Then you can go and talk about each one separately, right? Define the theory, define emotional intelligence as a theory, including any relevant components, right? Because sometimes theories will be broken down. They'll have 2, 3, 4, 5 components sometimes that are relevant. And sometimes these components correspond to actually what's on the instrument. So define the components as well, right? Talk a little bit about who developed it. I mean, you're using sources this whole time, right? And talk a little bit about what researchers have used it for. And not only that, whoever developed it, what they developed it for, right? Because that's what theories do. Theories explain things. So whoever developed it, what did they develop it to explain? How have researchers used it, right? That shows that it's been used, that it's valid, people are using it, it's important. And then a little bit about how it connects to your study, right? And how it can help explain your results. That's sometimes a little trickier, but so you're talking about emotional intelligence in, let's say, high school teachers, right? There will be components to emotional intelligence, let's say, and I've forgotten them, but you have to talk a little bit about why emotional intelligence would be important to these teachers. How does it help us understand what they do? Why would they need it? So that's how it would connect to your own study. Again, the theoretical framework is a really good section to have an approved dissertation, you know, as an example to look at what how people have handled this section. Okay. After you would do that, if we're still with our example here for emotional intelligence, you would do the same thing for transformational leadership, right? Because those two theories are going to act as your theoretical framework. For a conceptual framework, again, more closely associated with qualitative studies. And that's because, and I take a real practical approach to the framework section. And now there are articles that you can read that will go into all kinds of details and in depth about these. But I kind of stick with qualitative studies are more associated with conceptual frameworks, theoretical frameworks are more associated with quantitative studies. I said that right. Yeah. So the qualitative study, there may not be a theory that kind of encompasses, you know, what you're doing, because you usually qualitative studies tend to be exploratory, and sometimes there's not a theory that captures or encompasses what you're trying to do. So you're going to have to kind of build a framework similar to the theoretical framework, but from the relevant concepts in the literature that are relevant to what you're doing, right? So let's go back to our qualitative purpose. The purpose of this generic qualitative study is to explore the challenges of African-American women as they advance in positions as university presidents in a sample setting. Let's just say the challenges African-American women face as they try to advance to a university presidents. You know, maybe there's not a theory that covers that. I mean, there are theories like the glass ceiling, and it's not to say you can't use a theory. You can if there's one, if there's a theory appropriate for you. But sometimes in qualitative studies, you just have to use a concept. Maybe the concept for this example would be career advancement, right? As a concept. Barriers African-American women encounter, and one might be, concept might be barriers. What are the barriers, the concept of the barrier or specific barriers. But if you use something like career advancement as a concept, right, then that would be the concept, not necessarily a theory, but you take it from the literature, from the relevant literature, and you source it with that material, much like you would a theory. And you do kind of the same thing with the theoretical framework, except that you're just not using full-blown theories. You're using, major relevant concepts that are relevant to what you're doing. And you kind of do the same thing. You define them. You talk about, what they mean, how researchers have kind of used these concepts, and how they relate to your study. And that's kind of the difference between theoretical and conceptual frameworks. If you just think of theories and concepts, that helps, right? One uses theories, one uses concepts. But the kind of the moves you make in both of these for this section are real similar. And also the conceptual framework for qualitative studies, it also helps to guide keep in mind, it helps to guide your interview questions, right? Because when you sit down to, not your research questions, but your interview questions, if you're doing interviews, if you're doing a qualitative study that involves interviews, you're gonna have to draft interview questions at some point that you're gonna ask your participants. And these, again, don't come from nowhere. They don't come from what you think is important. I mean, maybe a little bit, but your conceptual framework is gonna help guide you, right, for your interview questions. So that's an added, purpose, of the conceptual framework. Okay, nature of the study or study design. Again, this is a method section, so I'm not going to go into it too much. Usually in chapter 1, there's some kind of mention of the how, right, of the how you're going to conduct your study, the methods. Again, you're going to have a whole chapter devoted to it that's going to be, hyper specific. But at this point, usually in chapter 1, it may involve, obviously stating what your design is going to be. Usually, some kind of rationale for the selection of the design, some kind of a summary of your methodology, including who you're going to get data from, how you're going to collect data, how it's going to be analyzed. And again, if you're interested in more in-depth, information on the study design, check our methods webinars. Okay, definitions is usually a section, and it's usually in chapter 1 because it needs to come early. This is where you define the terms that are specific to your study, right? So a couple of rules here. No dictionary definitions, right? These are not general definitions. These are definitions from the literature, and its purpose is specifically, to define terms as they will be understood and used in your study. Okay, so any variables that you're studying, any factors, like to go back to our example, transformational leadership and emotional intelligence, those would definitely need to be defined here. Any major concepts, right? Now, you don't need to, I see people sometimes put methods terms in here, like deductive or inductive or their design, and you don't need to do that here. You're going to talk about your methods in your method sections. These are more of like concepts and factors and variables. So definitions should be in the form of sentences. I always put them in the form of sentences. Some people put them in the form of fragments. Some professors accept that, some don't. I just default to sentences. That way nobody can come back and say, hey, put these into sentences. Definitions should be clear and succinct. And I want to emphasize this. Definitions are not discussions, right? This is not a place to have a discussion about a term. Like, well, so-and-so defines this term this way, and somebody else defines it this way, but somebody else defines it yet this a different way. No, it's not a discussion. We want to know here how you're defining this term for your study, right? And the definition should come from the literature. They should be clear and succinct. What does that mean? It means you don't have to go on and on. You know, a couple sentences at the most. One sentence sometimes will do it. 2 sentences maybe if you need to. And just use simple, clear sentence construction. Emotional intelligence refers to, or emotional intelligence is defined as, or for the purposes of the study, emotional intelligence is defined as. Okay. You don't need to get tricky, right, or fancy. So clear, succinct. They need to be supported with peer-reviewed sources. Under no circumstances can you use dictionary definitions. These are specific terms that come from the literature, so they need peer-reviewed sources behind them. And I say sources should be recent when possible. I mean, yeah, in this section, it's not as important in other sections, but it's always just good to keep things recent when you can. Anything else here? Oh, yeah, order them chronologically. I'm sorry, not chronologically, alphabetically, right? Order your entries alphabetically. And usually just to set off the section, you don't need anything more than the following terms are defined for use in the study, period. And then you can go on with your definitions. Okay, I think that's it. Those significance. Sometimes this is also called implications. And professors like to refer to this section as the so what study. So you're doing a study on special educators leaving the field. So what? And they're being a little glib. And the idea is, how is this information going to be valuable and who's it going to be valuable to? So usually for this section, there's kind of 2 prongs, right? The one is significance to research or theory, and one is significance to practice, right? So this is, you're kind of forecasting, right? You're not sure how, you know, the results you're going to get and how they're going to be significant to research or to practice. So you're kind of forecasting, which you should have a good idea. Not necessarily what you're going to get, but how your information might be valuable, right? So when you're talking about contributions to research, contributions to theory, how might what you find, how might your findings contribute to the literature? How might they kind of give information to researchers that would allow them to maybe rethink, you know, research on the topic? Maybe your research will allow researchers to look at the topic in new ways, or from a way they haven't considered before, or to consider certain things that, like they haven't considered in the past, or maybe, show that a certain theory applies or doesn't apply. But there should be some kind of contributions that you can point to, or potential contributions that you can point to the literature. How is it going to add to the literature? What is it going to tell us? And the other prong is practice, right? How will the information you get from your study, how can it be valuable to people on the ground at the level of practice, right? So if you're doing an education study, your findings can be valuable to teachers, right? Obviously, it might also be valuable to administrators. It could, if you're doing an education study but involves parents, it might be valuable to parents. So, you want to talk about a little bit about who your information would be valuable to and how, right? So how would it inform teachers, for example, or administrators? So that's the other section. How does it how might your findings contribute to research? How might they contribute to practice? Some schools, and I think this is Walden, specifically. They kind of have a third little prong. In other schools, I don't think you have to worry about this, but they want you to talk a little bit about positive social change, like how information from your study might lead to positive social change. And in some cases, it's kind of, it's not that hard to get if you're, doing a study that's going to enhance like somebody's education or their well-being or some kind of medical outcomes. So, the link to positive social change there is usually pretty easy to make. Okay, so that's that section. Other sections, I've kind of squished a few sections into one here because these are, some schools have them, some schools don't. Some schools have some of them. So again, check your template. But usually there's some discussion of these, at least some of them, if not all of them. And they're a little tricky. They're not hard and they're not long. Just sometimes it can be difficult to see what they're asking for, and even once you understand it, what you should put there. So limitations, right? This is again forward-looking because this is your proposal. Any kind of weaknesses or shortcomings that you can foresee, right, that may affect your results, right? So big limitations for quantitative studies would be sample size, right? If you don't get a large enough sample size, that affects your statistical certainty. It becomes a big limitation. Would that be a limitation in your study? It depends, if how easy or how difficult you think it is to get access to the folks you need to get access to. Qualitative studies, limitations sometimes involve if you're too close to the study, or you're a teacher and you're doing an education study, right? It's something that you're involved in. Sometimes with qualitative studies, it's always a potential limitation that you're too close. It's hard to be objective. You would just note that in the limitation section, right? And kind of discuss maybe some ways how you might mitigate that or prevent or reduce that bias, that potential bias. And there are ways to reduce researcher bias. So any things that you foresee is kind of may get in the way and may affect the study enough to affect the results. You want to put it here. As well as any kind of ways that you might help try to address those limitations should they occur. All right, assumptions. These are the kinds of aspects of a study that you don't have control over, right? So you just have to assume things. So a big one is you don't have control over participants, right? In qualitative or quantitative studies, if they're filling out surveys or if they're answering interview questions, you don't have control over what they say. So you just have to assume, a major assumption is that you have to assume that after you ensure them that their responses will be anonymous, after you assure them that their responses will be confidential, that they're going to answer you honestly and to the best of their ability, right? You just have to assume that. You don't have any control over that. Sometimes other assumptions, if you're using archival data, right, or data sets, data that's already been collected, sometimes you have to assume that you don't have any control over the way the data was collected. So you have to assume that it was collected using sound and valid methods. So that's kind of what the assumption is about. Let's see, scope. Sometimes this is called delimitations. And this is kind of the limitation, and delimitation has the word limitations in it, but they're not the same. Scope, it's like the boundaries of your study, right, that you put on it, right? It's going to kind of sound like the purpose, and it's going to kind of restate your participants, your setting, your topic, what you're doing, everything that's included in your study. And sometimes this is helpful. Let's say, again, you're doing an education study and you're just going to be, involving parents, right? Because you want to know how well they, parental support for homework or something at home. And it just involves parents. So it might be a good place to say, no, it's not going to involve teachers. It's not going to involve students. It's not going to involve administrators, just the parents. So it's a way if you look through a scope like a binoculars or something, it's just what you see, right? It's not the black stuff around. That's the stuff that's being excluded. It's the boundaries of your studies, what's being included in your study. Okay. And here we are at the summary. So the summary, just like any summary of any chapter, it recaps major points of the chapter. It's also a good idea here, because it is your chapter 1, remind the reader of the research problem. Remember, that's the kind of that drives the whole study, right? That's the kind of why of your study. Remind the reader of your research problem and why your study is needed. And you can end, if you want, by transitioning to the next chapter. Okay, and this is it. So if you have any questions, you want to start writing them down, that's fine. But just one last slide here. This is who we are, what we provide, the services we provide, our contact information. It's a free consultation. So if you just want to check and see if what we offer is right for you, that would be great. We do offer other webinars on different chapters and different topics. So check our schedule and see what we're offering, and see if you want to check in on some of those. All right. Okay, Sherry, you got that one. Thank you. All right. Any other questions related to the content? Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. Any questions? Everybody's good with the chapter 1 then? All right. Well, if everybody's good, like I said, we do offer other webinars on other chapters, other topics. Check in with us. And, call us, contact us if you think you want to see if what we offer is right for you. And have a great rest of your day, everybody. And I'll see you at the next webinar, maybe. All right. Take care, everybody. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Okay, let me copy the resources. Oh, thank you. All right, everybody. Thank you for coming. Have a great day.